Hey, what's up guys, Gons here for the Face Like the Sun YouTube channel. If you're into anime or you're familiar with anime, you've probably heard of the show called Death Note. You'll see Death Note among the top of many lists of best anime ever. For example, Ranker.com listed Death Note as the #1 anime of all time. But as I will demonstrate in this video, this show is really the Illuminati anime of the generation. And what I mean by that is it outlines perfectly of spiritual wickedness in high places and how they influence us and how the elite and the rulers of this world want to control you and want to ultimately see your end. In other words, it's really the satanic perspective at play here and what they want out of the youth culture, which I will show later has already had an impact in very disturbing ways. Now, Death Note follows a character named Light Yagami, a high school student who discovers a supernatural notebook from a Shinigami named Ryuk that grants its user the ability to kill anyone whose names and face he knows. So first off, the notebook here is sort of a reverse book of life. If you write somebody's name in the book, that person dies, and you can even write how they die. But here's what's weird. The name of the main character is Light. Come on folks, who's the light bearer? That's right, it's Lucifer. And that's no surprise. But what's weird is that in the Japanese form of his name, if you use the kanji, his name actually is Moon. And while Lucifer has its connection to Venus in the occult, the moon also has a very strange connection to the unseen entities described in Ephesians 6:12. Here's what it says in Ephesians 6:12, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." Now, if you go dig into the lexicon, the word that's translated for the world forces or ruler of this world is cosmocrators. Now, according to Strong's Concordance, a cosmocrator is, quote, ruler of this world, that is, of the world as asserting its independence of God, used of the angelic or demonic powers controlling the sublunary world. The sublunary world is the world under the moon. Sublunary, right? So it's really interesting that the kanji for Light Yagami is moon, but they call him Light. And I don't think this is by accident. I believe there is a very strong connection to Lucifer with this character, and it'll become more obvious as we go forward. The other thing to point out about this character is that there's a little bit of homoeroticism in the show. And it's been pointed out that if you look at his name, Yagami, and you flip it backwards, crudely, you can get I am gay. It's not an exact reverse, but if you take the I, the M, and the G-A-Y, it certainly says I am gay. So maybe there is a hidden agenda there, or even if there wasn't something there on purpose, it certainly is there by spiritual influence. But even if all that was just made up and just a coincidence, it's true that Yagami in Japanese means night god. Now, the Shinigami named Ryuk that gives Light Yagami this notebook is basically a lowercase g god. Shinigami in Japanese, shini means death and gami means god. He's literally a death god. And in Japanese tradition, the Shinigami is a spirit that drives people to death. Legend has it that if one was possessed by a Shinigami, they would want to commit suicide. Now, coming from a Christian worldview, this is clearly a demonic entity trying to steal your soul and bring you to hell, a place that was made for the devil and his angels, not for humans. Let's keep that in mind. Other Japanese writings have suggested that the Shinigami is a god that decides the time of one's death. And in other parts of Japanese culture, the Yama, who is called the king of the underworld, as well as the Japanese traditional Oni demon, are both considered to be Shinigami, or death gods. Now, some researchers and academics have suggested that these death gods are different from the Western gods of death. But this is a little bit hard to believe, as I think the Bible itself talks explicitly about death as an entity. We have in 1 Corinthians 15:55, where it talks about Christ's victory over death and our victory over death as a result of it. It says, "O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" Furthermore, in the book of Revelation, several times death is referred to as an entity. In Revelation 6:8, it says, "And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him." Revelation 20 verse 13 says, "And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them according to what they had done." So death and Hades each get judged. And then the next verse, Revelation 20 verse 14, "Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, a lake of fire. So again, the Bible speaks of death as an entity, and the connection here to the Shinigami is pretty obvious in my opinion. Now, the series centers around Light Yagami's attempt to create and rule a world cleansed of evil as God using this powerful notebook. And these themes are repeated and are on display in a pretty obvious fashion as you watch the show. Now on to the plot. I won't get into all the details of the entire series, but I will lay out some overall themes and give you some spoilers as well in there, but the show is pretty old, so no surprises there. Now, Light Yagami is a genius high school student who discovers the Death Note, a notebook that kills anyone whose name is written in it. After experimenting with the notebook, which results in murders of criminals, Light meets the Shinigami named Ryuk, the death god, who was the notebook's original owner. Now, he dropped the notebook into the human world out of boredom. And it's interesting because the world in which Ryuk resides seems to be a depiction of the underworld. The dark, deserted atmosphere that's displayed there clearly represents a dark spiritual dimension. In fact, some of the music or background music that plays while they show this other dimension or other world is what the Catholics call the Kyrie Eleison, or Lord Have Mercy, which to me reminds me of the fallen angels or watchers that we read about in the book of Enoch, who basically, after committing a abominable sin, asked the Lord for mercy, but the Lord said no, and they were thrown into Tartarus. Now, as Light becomes more aware of the power he possesses over life and death with his notebook, he becomes ambitious about becoming the ruler of a new world. This is how he describes it, a new world, and becoming the ruler of it as God. Free from criminals, living himself as a god amongst men, where only the people that Light Yagami deems morally fit can remain alive. Does it sound familiar? If you've studied up on the Antichrist figure, the mark of the beast, the image of the beast, this would sound very familiar. Now, Light Yagami eventually becomes known to the public as Kira, which is basically a poor Japanese pronunciation of the word killer. Now, the public doesn't know who Light Yagami is, they just know that there's somebody, a killer, a Kira, out there who is killing criminals, almost like a vigilante thing. Kira's killings of criminals eventually catches the attention of Interpol and the world-famous detective known as L. Now, while the character's name is represented with the letter L, let's remember what the Hebrew word for God is, El. Again, I don't think this is on accident. The writers of this show knows some stuff and decided that El would be a great name for this other character. Now, the drama that surrounds El and Light, and then later Misa, who also had her notebook given by another Shinigami named Rem, becomes more and more intense, wrapped up in deception upon deception. And I won't get into all the details of the drama, but Light Yagami is basically the king of manipulation. And as the series goes on, there's a part where he loses control of the notebook, but later gets it back and continues to kill, all the while being part of the team trying to discover the killer. And L, who was one of the smartest characters in the show, was on to Light. He knew that Light was the guy, but he just couldn't figure out how to pin him down. Or at least that's what some people believe. Eventually, L is killed after Light Yagami manipulates the Shinigami named Rem. Now afterward, Light becomes the second L, pursuing the search for the killer, all while being the killer himself. Now this is again a mockery almost of Jesus Christ. Not only is Jesus known as the second Adam, but the mere fact that Light, the Lucifer light-bearer character, defeats El, God, and becomes the second El, I think represents the very fabric of what Lucifer wants to do. And we read about this in Isaiah 14, where he talks about ascending above the throne of God, making himself like the Most High. In fact, one of the things the Antichrist says he will do is found in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, where he will oppose and exalt himself against every so-called god or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. That's exactly what Light Yagami was shooting for. And in the end, when the jig is up, the Shinigami that we first encountered, named Ryuk, kills Light Yagami after realizing he can no longer be useful or entertaining to him. Now again, that's just an overview of the plot. Very brief, very quick. I know there's lots of things in there that I missed, and if you're a Death Note fan, you're probably screaming in your seat because I missed all these biblical references, and I'll touch on some of those in a moment here. But I hope you're starting to see how this show has the threads of the Antichrist spirit all over it, and why it's become so popular with young people, and why I think it is the Illuminati anime of the generation. Now, these themes here are very powerful. In the end, the one who walks away alive in this show is the Shinigami, Ryuk. The implications are that humanity to the Shinigami, this death god, was just folly, toys to entertain them, and that's partly why the Death Note was even brought into this world. Since Ryuk, at the beginning of the show, says that he dropped the notebook because he was bored. But in the end, what this depicts is that the fallen angel wins, and the human, even the one as ambitious as Light Yagami, smart, wanting to eliminate crime, wanting to create a peaceful world, wanting to become God, is futile. And coming from a biblical worldview, I can't help but see the parallels between how this story plays out and what's prophesied to be administered by Satan and the Antichrist, who's basically his human or maybe extra human puppet. Because we know that the Antichrist will be a tool for Satan, perhaps even for his amusement, because Satan knows that his time is short and that his destination is hell. But the manipulation of a man through the gift of power, supernatural power, through a relic or maybe even technology sounds eerily similar to the world we live in today, where we've speculated and talked about the many powers that are being harnessed by man and perhaps being given instruction by fallen spiritual entities. And while we don't necessarily have a specific notebook that kills someone whose names are written in it, we know that Satan has offered this sort of authority and power over the world if they would only submit to him. And we read that in Matthew 4, verses 8 through 10, where it talks about the devil taking Jesus to a high mountain and showing him the kingdoms of the world and all their glory. And Satan said to Jesus, "All these I will give to you if you fall down and worship me." Now Jesus says, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve." But in effect, this offer that Satan gave to Jesus has probably been offered to people in high places of power and authority in this world, and I'm willing to bet that they have taken up the offer based on the trickle-down effect of culture and society that we see today. Now, the writer of Death Note, Tsugumi Oba, had no particular theme in mind when he wrote Death Note, or at least that's what he said, but when he was pressed on it, he stated, quote, "Humans will all eventually die and never come back to life. So let's give it our all while we're alive." And later he went on to say, quote, "No human has the right to pass judgment on another's actions. No one should play God." And he said that the character Nier and his climactic speech about good and evil was rooted in his own beliefs about good and evil. But this statement is interesting because while it appeals tremendously to an atheistic or even nihilistic perspective of life, since he believes that, we die and never come back to life, it's also got its problems logically. He says that no one has the right to pass judgment on another's actions. No one should play God, which on the surface sounds accurate, but if you pay close attention, it's a contradiction. By suggesting himself that no one has the right to judge, he is making a statement of judgment. And by stating no one should play God, he is in fact speaking as if he knows that this is the best approach to life, as if he were God himself. Do you see the hubris? It's very subtle, but it's there. And while I agree that no one should play God, and in my opinion, personally, no one can really play God, Satan and his fallen ones will attempt to do just that in the end times, and we're seeing it all around us. Now, at the end of the series, Light Yagami is seen as being crucified. And according to the Death Note trivia, quote, Light is portrayed in a crucified-like position on the 12th and final manga cover. This position is mimicked by Light during the second ending sequence in the anime, and again when he is portrayed as a secret Nendoroid figure for the Death Note case file merchandise line. This position connects Light's desire to be a messiah figure of the human race, similar to the Christian messiah, Jesus Christ. Now let me read some quotes from the show. In chapter 1 of the manga, Light Yagami says, quote, "I'm going to make the world know I'm here, that somebody is passing righteous judgment on them." And then later he says, "I will reign over a new world." And in episode 1 of the anime series, quote, "Follow the teachings of God and receive his blessings, and so it shall be that the seas again become bountiful." And then in episode 37, quote, "Under normal circumstances, humans should have continued to evolve as the greatest creatures upon this earth, but we were actually regressing, a rotten world, politics, law, education. Was there anybody around who could correct this world? But someone had to do it." And then later in episode 37, quote, "I understand that killing people was a crime. There was no other way. The world had to be fixed. a purpose given to me. Only I could do it. Who else could have done it and come this far? Would they have kept going? The only one who can create a new world is me. Now, if that wasn't enough, there's other images that mock the Bible, mock Christians. There's a scene where L washes Light's feet. Now, we read about Jesus washing the feet of his disciples in John chapter 13. And basically, this was in the upper room just prior to the Last Supper and afterwards where Jesus gets crucified. And to mock this point, the character of L represents Jesus or God, and Light Yagami representing Lucifer is taking this biblical demonstration of service and humility and turning it on its head to worship Light Yagami. Because remember, after this point, L is killed and Light Yagami becomes the second L. Now in 2012, there was a paper for the Japanese Journal of Religious Studies by Julian Baraka Thomas, who characterized Death Note as heavily influenced by the conflicts between liberty and security, as illustrating that high moral ideals are easily corrupted and that people will always justify horrific acts of violence in the name of safety. Thomas wrote, quote, "The price of peace is death," end quote. Now, Thomas's paper lists Death Note as one of the later and more sophisticated psychological thrillers, saying that it examines the human tendency to express itself through horrific cults and describes the negative effects of those cults on the members, on their families, and on society. And through the moral relativity that characterizes the story throughout, the readers and watchers of the series are reminded that their own ideas of good and evil might not differ so much from the extremist cult members. And so this anime has reached the homes of millions of people all around the world. And the message here is very nihilistic. It's ultimately hopeless. And it's no surprise that this show has the imagery that is full of dark references to demons, the underworld, and Lucifer himself, with the main character being named Light. And this nihilistic message of hopelessness is enhanced with basically the message that Aleister Crowley of the OTO said, "Do as thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." And in fact, the impact that this show has had in culture is significant. In 2007, Death Note was banned in Beijing, and in 2009, the Chinese Ministry of Culture blacklisted Death Note and other animes as a means to control what the Chinese people consume. Now, you might think, well, that's counter to this whole idea of Death Note being the Illuminati anime of the generation, but if you really think about it, by banning it, you're basically raising interest, especially for the young rebellious people. And I think this is on purpose. By blacklisting it, by banning it, it's only raising the popularity of the show. Now, in 2007, there was a murder case in Belgium where the murderer left a note that said, quote, "Watashi wa kira desu," which means "I am the killer" in Japanese, a clear reference to the show Death Note. And in 2010, 4 men were arrested for this murder. In 2008, a middle school student was suspended for having his own Death Note notebook, which included George W. Bush, the president at the time. And in 2010, another middle school student was found with his own Death Note, which included kids from his class and Justin Bieber, which I don't necessarily blame him for. In 2009, an 8-year-old Australian boy had his own Death Note along with a battle plan for where to place bombs in his school. Now, keep in mind, this kid was 8 years old, and influenced by Death Note, he was planning to place bombs in his school. Think about that. Spiritually, where's that coming from? In 2008, 2 6th graders were arrested for having their own Death Note with students and staff members written in it. And in 2013, a teenage girl from Russia committed suicide, and near her body was found 4 volumes of Death Note. And it got so out of control that a local parents group even wrote a letter to Vladimir Putin calling for the ban of all Death Note related media. So this show has clearly impacted a generation that identified with the tragic character that is Light Yagami and the overall dark spirituality and nihilism and hopelessness that this show represents. But remember, as Christians, there is hope. That's the message of the gospel. We are promised a resurrection, but our decision to accept or reject Yeshua, Jesus Christ, will ultimately determine your destination: in hell, where the devil and his angels belong, or in the divine counsel of God, the rightful place of inheritance for all humans under the grace of Jesus Christ. I think the answer is pretty simple. Don't be fooled by shows like Death Note and its popularity. Don't let it fill the spiritual void that you feel, and let these programs define you as it has for so many people in this generation. Wake up, see the real light and the real truth that comes from Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, and the life. Have an awesome day, guys. God bless.